Sometimes the biggest mistake of your life is the one that quietly leads you home. At exactly 8:12 on a chilly Tuesday morning, Ethan Walker adjusted the worn strap of his faded tool bag and hurried through the polished marble lobby of Hayes Global Tower. He hated being late. Every minute mattered when you were raising an 8-year-old daughter alone, paying bills one careful dollar at a time, and trying to convince yourself that tomorrow would somehow be kinder than yesterday. His old work boots left faint traces of rainwater across the gleaming floor as executives in tailored suits drifted around him without a second glance. Their conversations echoed through the towering glass atrium, full of stock prices, mergers, and vacations that felt as distant to Ethan as another planet. He checked the maintenance request clipped to his clipboard. Electrical inspection. 48th floor. He spotted an elevator just as its doors began to close. "Hold it, please." The doors slid open again. Ethan stepped inside with a grateful nod, never noticing the discreet silver emblem above the doorway. Executive access only. The elevator moved silently upward, smoother than anything he had ever ridden. Soft piano music floated through hidden speakers while polished walnut panels reflected his tired face. He caught his own reflection and almost smiled. His daughter Lily had insisted he wear the blue flannel because she said it made him look younger. "You look like the dads in the Christmas movies," she had whispered before school, wrapping her small arms around his waist. Thinking of her warmed him more than the expensive elevator ever could. The doors opened on the top executive floor. Conversations stopped. Several assistants looked up from their tablets. One security officer frowned. Another executive exchanged a puzzled glance with a colleague. Maintenance staff never came through this entrance. Ethan noticed the silence a heartbeat too late. "Sir," a sharply dressed receptionist said carefully, "I believe you may have taken the wrong elevator." Ethan blinked, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I was just trying to get a maintenance on 48. Before anyone answered, another set of doors opened across the hallway. Charlotte Hayes stepped out surrounded by board members, attorneys, and advisors discussing a billion-dollar acquisition scheduled to begin in less than 5 minutes. She walked with calm confidence earned through years of impossible decisions, impossible expectations, and a life where everyone wanted something from her except honesty. Her charcoal suit was flawless. Her expression revealed nothing. She barely glanced toward the unexpected visitor standing beside the executive elevator. Then she saw his face. The folder slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the polished floor like startled birds. Her breath caught so suddenly that even the attorneys stopped speaking. For one impossible moment, the richest woman in the building looked less like a celebrated CEO and more like someone staring into a memory she had spent 15 years trying to find again. Ethan instinctively bent down to help gather the fallen papers. "Ma'am," he said softly, offering the first page with the same quiet kindness he showed everyone, "I think these are yours." Charlotte never reached for them. Her eyes remained fixed on him, wide with disbelief, as though time itself had refused to move. Around them, the hallway became impossibly still. No phones rang. No conversations continued. Even the gentle hum of the climate system seemed to disappear beneath the weight of one impossible question neither of them was ready to ask. "It can't be," Charlotte whispered, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. Ethan frowned politely, completely unaware that one wrong elevator had just reopened the single unfinished chapter in both of their lives. Charlotte Hayes remained frozen long after every sheet of paper had been collected. Ethan placed the neatly stacked documents in her trembling hands with the same quiet courtesy he would have shown anyone else, then offered an apologetic smile. "I really am sorry for interrupting your morning," he said gently. "I will find the correct elevator next time." He tipped his head respectfully before walking toward the reception desk, completely unaware that dozens of curious eyes had followed every step he took. No one spoke until the maintenance worker disappeared around the corner. Then whispers spread through the executive floor like wind through autumn leaves. One attorney leaned closer to another. "Have you ever seen her react like that?" The answer came in a quiet shake of the head. Charlotte had built a reputation for perfect composure. Investors trusted her because she never hesitated. Competitors feared her because she never revealed emotion. Yet one ordinary man carrying a weather tool bag had reduced years of practiced confidence to stunned silence. Her executive assistant, Rebecca Collins, stepped forward carefully. "Miss Hayes, the board meeting begins in 4 minutes." Charlotte blinked as though waking from a dream. Her eyes never left the hallway where Ethan had vanished. "Cancel it." Rebecca stared in disbelief. "Cancel the acquisition meeting? Reschedule every appointment before noon." The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. That meeting involved months of negotiations and billions of dollars. Charlotte had never postponed a board meeting in her entire career. "Rebecca," she continued quietly, "I need everything you can find on the maintenance employee who just left this floor." Rebecca hesitated. "Did he do something inappropriate?" Charlotte answered almost in a whisper. "No." Her fingers tightened around the folder Ethan had returned to her. "I believe he once saved my life." Meanwhile, Ethan finally reached the 48th floor after taking the correct elevator. The electrical room buzzed softly with the familiar sound of transformers and ventilation fans. He slipped on his work gloves, opened the maintenance panel, and focused on the inspection checklist. Work had always been his way of quieting every worry. Rent was due next week. Lily needed new sneakers before school started basketball practice. The old pickup truck still made a strange noise whenever he turned left. Real life left very little room for daydreams. His supervisor, Frank Morales, walked in carrying a tablet. "Walker, what happened upstairs?" Ethan looked up in confusion. "Nothing, I think. I took the wrong elevator by accident." Frank scratched his chin. "Security called asking about you. I figure maybe you broke something." Ethan laughed softly. "I only embarrassed myself." Frank smiled. "That makes 2 of us this week." They returned to work without another thought. Across the building, however, Charlotte stood alone inside her office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city stretched for miles beneath the morning sun, but she barely noticed it. Instead, she slowly opened a locked drawer inside her desk. Hidden beneath old financial reports rested a small, faded photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The edges had softened with time, and the colors had nearly disappeared. It showed a rainy downtown sidewalk from 15 years earlier. One figure stood partially turned away from the camera, his face blurred by the weather, wearing a blue flannel shirt remarkably similar to the one Ethan wore that very morning. Charlotte traced the worn photograph with trembling fingertips before whispering to herself, "Please do not disappear again before I learn your name." Rebecca spent the next hour quietly assembling everything the company had on Ethan Walker. The file should have been ordinary. It was only 7 pages long. Employment records, tax forms, emergency contact information, annual performance reviews that repeated the same words year after year. Reliable, honest, never complains, always volunteers for extra shifts. Charlotte read every line twice. There was no history of promotions because Ethan had never asked for one. No disciplinary reports because he had never caused trouble. His salary barely covered a modest apartment on the west side of Chicago, yet according to the payroll notes, he had declined overtime several Friday afternoons during the school year. Rebecca noticed Charlotte studying those entries. "Those are the days he picks up his daughter from elementary school," she explained. Human Resources asked if he wanted additional hours, but he always said that dinner with his little girl mattered more. Charlotte lowered the file slowly. The sentence settled deep inside her heart. In boardrooms, she had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, yet a father choosing homemade spaghetti over extra income somehow felt more extraordinary than any business victory she had ever witnessed. "Tell me about his daughter," she asked softly. Rebecca opened another page. "Her name is Lily Walker, 8 years old, excellent student. Her teachers describe her as kind, curious, and always talking about her father." Charlotte smiled before she realized she was smiling. She had not done that inside this office for longer than she could remember. Meanwhile, the afternoon sun poured through the maintenance workshop where Ethan carefully packed away his tools. His phone vibrated. A picture message appeared from Lily. She stood beside a cardboard model of the solar system she had built for science class, her front tooth missing and her grin impossibly wide. Under the picture she had typed with careful spelling, "Did you eat lunch, Daddy?" Ethan laughed quietly and replied, "Yes, sweetheart. Did you remember your apple?" A few seconds later came her answer, "Yes. Mrs. Parker says my planets are awesome." Ethan slipped the phone back in his pocket, feeling lighter than he had all day. Across town, no one would have guessed that the happiest part of his afternoon came from a text message rather than a paycheck. Charlotte closed Ethan's file, but could not silence the growing questions in her mind. She walked toward the wide windows overlooking Lake Michigan, where tiny boats drifted peacefully beneath the bright spring sky. 15 years earlier, she had been 20 years old, exhausted, frightened, and carrying more uncertainty than hope. She had believed success belonged only to people born into powerful families. Then one rainy evening, a stranger had appeared without asking for recognition, reward, or even gratitude. He had offered simple kindness when she had needed it most. Before she could properly thank him, he had disappeared into the storm, leaving behind nothing except the memory of calm blue eyes and a voice that made impossible situations seem temporary. Every attempt to find him afterward had failed. Years passed. Businesses grew. Fortune arrived. Awards filled her office. Yet the unanswered question had quietly remained in one hidden corner of her heart. Now those same calm eyes had stepped out of an executive elevator, carrying a faded toolbox instead of dreams for himself. Charlotte looked once more at the photograph resting beside Ethan's employee badge. The resemblance was no longer something she could dismiss as coincidence. It felt like destiny had finally circled back after 15 silent years. And for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she realized the most important decision waiting for her had nothing to do with business at all. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that spilled across downtown Chicago, turning the glass towers into walls of gold. Ethan Walker parked his aging pickup in the employee lot 15 minutes early, just as he always did. Routine gave him peace. Predictability was a luxury life had not often offered, so he protected the small habits that remained. He greeted the security guard by name, accepted a paper cup of coffee from the break room, and began reviewing the maintenance requests waiting for him. To Ethan, it was another ordinary Wednesday. To Charlotte Hayes, it was the first morning in 15 years that hope had outweighed certainty. She stood quietly behind the tinted windows of her executive office as employees streamed into the building below like tiny moving pieces in a carefully organized world. Then she spotted him. Even from 48 stories above, she recognized the unhurried pace, the worn brown jacket folded neatly over one arm, and the small wave he gave the parking attendant before entering the lobby. Power had taught Charlotte to study people. Success had taught her to question motives. Yet everything about Ethan suggested a man who expected nothing from anyone except the chance to earn an honest living. "Move my afternoon strategy meeting," she told Rebecca without turning away from the window. "Again?" Rebecca asked gently. Charlotte nodded. "I want to visit building services." Rebecca almost smiled. In 10 years, she had never known the chief executive officer to voluntarily spend time in the maintenance department. Downstairs, Ethan was replacing worn electrical fixtures in a quiet conference room when he heard footsteps behind him. He climbed down from the ladder and looked surprised to find Charlotte standing in the doorway with only Rebecca beside her. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes," he said politely, wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. "Is something wrong with the room?" Charlotte searched his face for another hint of recognition, but found only calm professionalism. "No," she answered softly. "I was told you were one of our most dependable employees. I wanted to thank you for your work." Ethan looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I appreciate that, ma'am. I just try to leave every place a little better than I found it." The simple sentence lingered in the room. Rebecca glanced toward Charlotte, noticing the faint change in her expression. Hundreds of executives had tried to impress the chief executive officer with polished presentations and carefully rehearsed speeches. None had moved her with a sentence as ordinary as that. Charlotte stepped farther inside. "How long have you worked here?" Almost 6 years. And before that, Ethan smiled politely. A little bit of everything. Construction, delivery driving, small repair shops, whatever helped keep food on the table. He spoke without bitterness, as though difficult years were simply chapters that had shaped him instead of burdens that defined him. Charlotte noticed a small drawing taped inside his open toolbox. Bright crayons had formed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling yellow sun. Across the top, written in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "My hero is my daddy." Ethan followed her gaze and chuckled quietly. "Lily insists that picture travels with me everywhere." His voice carried a warmth that no title or fortune could purchase. Charlotte felt something inside her heart soften in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She realized that while the world had spent years celebrating everything she had built, no one had ever looked at her the way one little girl clearly looked at her father. As Ethan returned to tightening the final screw in the light fixture, Charlotte understood that the man she had searched for across countless years had not merely survived. Somehow, through loss, sacrifice, and ordinary days that no newspaper would ever report, he had quietly become exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Charlotte never announced another surprise visit, yet somehow her schedule began to overlap with Ethan's more often than coincidence could reasonably explain. One afternoon, she appeared in the lobby during a routine inspection of the building. Another morning, she quietly toured the engineering floor while Ethan adjusted a faulty air conditioning unit. She never interrupted his work for long. She simply asked small questions that no one had ever bothered asking before. "How is your day going? Did the repair go smoothly? Have you had lunch yet?" Ethan answered each one with the same humble sincerity, never imagining that the most powerful woman in the company was searching for something far beyond conversation. To everyone else, it looked like a chief executive officer taking a new interest in company culture. Only Charlotte knew she was trying to understand the man whose kindness had quietly shaped the course of her own life. Late Friday afternoon, Ethan finished replacing a damaged ceiling panel and checked the time. 3:35. He smiled to himself. Lily's elementary school dismissed at 4. He packed his tools carefully, nodded goodbye to Frank Morales, and drove across town with the windows rolled halfway down as warm spring air drifted through the old pickup. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Jefferson Elementary watching children race toward waiting parents. Then a little girl with bright blue eyes and a purple backpack spotted him from across the sidewalk. "Daddy!" Lily ran into his arms without slowing down. Ethan laughed as he lifted her easily from the ground. "How was my favorite scientist today? Mrs. Parker put my solar system in the hallway because everyone wanted to see it. I knew they would. And I got 100% on my spelling test. That deserves pancakes tonight." Lily wrapped both arms around his neck. "Even chocolate chip pancakes?" Ethan pretended to think very seriously. "I suppose. Extraordinary achievements require extraordinary pancakes." Neither of them noticed a black sedan parked discreetly across the street. Charlotte sat quietly inside after leaving a nearby community meeting earlier than planned. She had recognized Ethan's truck by chance and watched from a respectful distance as father and daughter laughed together beneath the afternoon sun. There were no photographers, no board members, no investors, only a father celebrating a spelling test as though it were the greatest accomplishment in the world. Charlotte felt tears gathering before she even understood why. She had spent years measuring success in quarterly reports, market value, and international expansion. Ethan measured success by whether his daughter smiled on the ride home. Somehow his definition felt infinitely richer. As Ethan buckled Lily into the passenger seat, she held up a folded drawing. "Daddy, I made somebody new for our family picture." Ethan unfolded the paper. Beside the familiar sketches of himself and Lily stood another figure with long brown hair, wearing a business suit. "Who is she?" he asked gently. Lily shrugged with the innocent certainty only children possess. "I do not know yet. I just think somebody nice is coming into our lives." Ethan smiled and carefully folded the picture before placing it inside the dashboard compartment. Then we will save her a place until we meet her. Across the street, Charlotte watched the truck disappear into evening traffic. She never saw the drawing, never heard Lily's words, yet an unfamiliar peace settled over her heart. For the first time in many years, she did not feel driven by ambition or haunted by regret. She simply felt grateful that fate had quietly given her another chance to find the goodness she thought she had lost forever. Monday arrived with a gentle spring rain that painted the streets of Chicago in shimmering reflections. Ethan Walker pulled his pickup beneath the employee parking canopy and sat quietly for a moment before turning off the engine. Lily's drawing still rested inside the dashboard compartment. Every morning he looked at it before work, smiling at the mysterious woman his daughter believed would someday become part of their story. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. Children believed in wonderful things because no one had yet convinced them to stop. Upstairs, Charlotte Hayes stood beside the wide windows of her office, holding the faded photograph in one hand and Ethan's employee badge in the other. For nearly 2 weeks, she had searched her own memories, afraid they had woven together hope and coincidence into something that was never real. Today she had decided that uncertainty had lasted long enough. She asked Rebecca to clear her afternoon calendar and quietly invite Ethan to the executive dining room after his shift. "Do not tell him why," she said. "Simply tell him I would appreciate a few minutes of his time." Ethan almost declined. He could not imagine why the chief executive officer would want to meet with a maintenance technician again. Frank finally convinced him. "If the boss invites you, at least hear what she has to say." At 5 o'clock, Ethan entered the private dining room, carrying the same humble posture he carried everywhere else. Charlotte was already waiting beside a table overlooking the river. There were no executives, no assistants, no reporters. Only 2 cups of fresh coffee rested between them. "Thank you for coming," she said warmly. Ethan smiled politely. "You said you wanted to speak with me, ma'am." Charlotte hesitated for the first time in years. Negotiating billion-dollar agreements had always been easier than asking one deeply personal question. Finally, she reached into her leather portfolio and carefully placed the faded photograph on the table. Ethan looked down with quiet curiosity. Rain streaked across an old city sidewalk. A young man stood partly turned away, wearing a blue flannel shirt that looked strangely familiar. "Does this picture mean anything to you?" Charlotte asked softly. Ethan studied it for several long seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. "I am sorry. I wish I could help, but I do not remember it." Charlotte nodded, though disappointment briefly crossed her face. She expected that answer. 15 years was a long time. Memories faded differently for different people. She drew a slow breath before speaking again. 15 years ago, I was 20 years old. I had just lost my scholarship, my apartment, and nearly all hope that my future would become anything more than survival. Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. It was raining harder than I had ever seen. I was standing outside Union Station with one suitcase and almost no money. I believed my life was over. Her voice became softer. A stranger noticed that I was crying. He bought me a cup of coffee. He gave me enough money for a train ticket home. More importantly, he looked at me and said something I've carried every day since. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Charlotte smiled through misting eyes. He said, "This is not the end of your story. One difficult chapter does not decide the whole book." Silence settled gently between them. Ethan lowered his eyes as though listening to a distant echo hidden somewhere beyond memory. Then, almost without thinking, he quietly repeated the final sentence before Charlotte could say it herself. "Tomorrow always deserves a chance to surprise you." Charlotte's breath caught. She had never written those words down. She had never shared them with another living soul. Yet somehow the man sitting across from her had finished the sentence exactly as it had been spoken beneath the rain 15 years earlier. And in that quiet moment, neither of them could deny that destiny had finally revealed the truth. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The soft rain tapped gently against the wide dining room windows while the lights of downtown Chicago slowly awakened beyond the glass. Ethan stared quietly at the old photograph before lifting his eyes to Charlotte once more. "I remember the rain now," he admitted softly. I remember seeing someone standing alone outside the station. But I never knew who you became. Charlotte smiled with quiet gratitude. You were not supposed to. You walked away before I could even ask your name. Ethan leaned back in his chair, almost embarrassed. It did not feel like something important. You looked like someone who needed a little hope. That was all. Charlotte lowered her gaze. Those simple words carried more weight than every acceptance speech she had ever delivered. She had spent years believing that success came from intelligence, discipline, and relentless determination. Sitting across from Ethan, she realized that the single moment which had changed her entire future had come from an ordinary act of compassion offered without expectation of reward. You changed my life, she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. No, you changed your own life. I only bought coffee and a train ticket. Charlotte smiled through moist eyes. Sometimes that is enough. Their conversation continued long after the coffee had grown cold. Ethan spoke about Lily with a quiet pride that always softened his voice. He described school science fairs, weekend pancake breakfasts, library visits, and bedtime stories they still read together every evening. Charlotte listened carefully, not because the stories were extraordinary, but because they revealed the kind of father Ethan had become. Every memory centered on Lily before himself. Every sacrifice sounded so natural that he hardly considered it a sacrifice at all. Meanwhile, outside the private dining room, curiosity had already begun spreading through the executive offices. Rebecca noticed two vice presidents exchanging uncertain glances near the elevators. Someone from accounting quietly mentioned that the chief executive officer had canceled another strategy session. An executive assistant whispered that the maintenance technician had spent nearly an hour inside the executive dining room. Before sunset, harmless questions had quietly become office gossip. By the following morning, rumors traveled through nearly every department. Some employees assumed Ethan was being promoted. Others claimed he had discovered a serious safety issue. A few invented stories that grew more dramatic each time they were repeated. Ethan noticed none of it. He simply returned to replacing worn light fixtures and repairing broken outlets exactly as he had every other day. Charlotte noticed everything. During a leadership meeting, one board member casually remarked, "You seem unusually interested in building services lately." Another executive smiled politely. It is refreshing to see management paying attention to every level of the company. The words sounded respectful, yet Charlotte recognized the quiet curiosity hidden beneath them. She answered calmly, "Every employee deserves to be seen." No one challenged her, but several exchanged thoughtful looks across the conference table. That afternoon, Ethan finished work and drove to Jefferson Elementary as usual. Lily climbed into the truck, carrying a small paper certificate decorated with colorful stars. "Daddy," she said proudly, "I won the Kindness Award today." Ethan laughed with genuine delight. "That sounds much more important than winning first place." Lily grinned. "Mrs. Parker says being kind is how you become unforgettable." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before smiling toward the road ahead. "Your teacher is a very wise woman." At that exact moment, several miles away, Charlotte stood alone inside her office looking at the Chicago skyline once again. She realized that she had spent 15 years searching for the man who once gave her hope, only to discover that he had quietly spent those same years teaching the next generation to live by the very same kindness that had once rescued a frightened young woman standing alone in the rain. The rumors that had quietly drifted through Hayes Global during the previous week finally reached the board of directors. By Monday morning, curiosity had hardened into concern. Several investors requested private explanations. A financial columnist published a brief article questioning why the chief executive officer had recently postponed multiple executive meetings while spending unexpected time with a maintenance employee. The story contained no accusations, only speculation. Yet speculation had a way of growing faster than truth. Charlotte read the article once, folded the newspaper neatly, and placed it aside without a word. She had spent years protecting the company's reputation. She refused to protect it now by pretending gratitude was something to hide. Later that afternoon, she invited Ethan to her office once again. He entered with the same respectful smile, though this time he sensed a quiet weight in the room. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked gently. Charlotte shook her head immediately. "No, you have done nothing except remind me what kind of leader I wanted to become." Ethan remained standing. "People are talking." She nodded. "I know." He looked through the windows toward the city below before speaking carefully. "Then perhaps it would be better if I found another job." Charlotte stared at him in surprise. "You would leave?" He smiled with the calm dignity she had come to recognize so well. "This company supports thousands of families. If my staying here creates distractions for you or for your employees, then leaving is a small price to pay." Charlotte stepped closer. "You would walk away after everything we have just discovered?" Ethan answered softly. "Kindness should never become someone else's burden." Those words settled heavily between them. Charlotte realized that even now, when offered recognition he had never expected, Ethan's first instinct was still to protect someone else. That evening, after returning home, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table while Lily colored another picture beside him. He quietly drafted a short resignation letter on a single sheet of paper. There were no complaints, no demands, only gratitude for 6 years of honest work and appreciation for every opportunity the company had given him. Lily looked up from her crayons. "Why are you writing so much, Daddy?" Ethan smiled gently. "Sometimes doing the right thing is not the easiest thing." She thought for a moment before placing one small hand over his. "Mrs. Parker says doing the right thing is how people sleep peacefully." Ethan laughed softly. "Your teacher keeps teaching both of us." The next morning, he arrived at Hayes Global before sunrise. The building was still quiet as he placed a sealed envelope on Rebecca's desk with a simple request. "Please give this to Miss Hayes when she arrives." Rebecca looked at the envelope, then back at Ethan. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "She has already given me something more valuable than a job. She gave me answers I never knew I was missing." Without another word, he picked up his worn tool bag and walked toward the maintenance workshop, intending to finish every scheduled repair before the end of the day with the same care he had shown since his first morning in the building. Nearly an hour later, Charlotte entered her office, accepted the envelope from Rebecca, and slowly unfolded the single handwritten page. As she reached the final sentence, her eyes filled with quiet tears. Ethan had ended the letter with the same words he had spoken beneath the rain 15 years earlier. "Tomorrow always deserves a chance to surprise you." Charlotte folded the letter against her heart and looked toward the executive elevator. For the second time in her life, the man who had changed everything was preparing to disappear without asking for anything in return, and this time she knew she would not let destiny walk away in silence. Charlotte did not wait for another meeting or another carefully planned announcement. She picked up Ethan's resignation letter, walked out of her office, and headed directly toward the executive boardroom, where the quarterly leadership session was already underway. 12 directors, senior executives, and major investors turned as she entered carrying only a single handwritten page instead of the presentation they expected. Rebecca quietly closed the doors behind her. The room settled into complete silence. Charlotte stood at the head of the long walnut table and looked at every face before speaking. "Before we discuss profits, forecasts, or expansion, there is something far more important this company needs to understand." Several directors exchanged uncertain glances, but no one interrupted. Charlotte lifted the letter slightly. "This morning, one of our employees offered to resign because he believed protecting this company mattered more than protecting himself." A board member frowned. "Are you referring to the maintenance technician?" Charlotte nodded. "His name is Ethan Walker, and every rumor you have heard has missed the only truth that matters." She paused, allowing the quiet to settle naturally across the room. 15 years ago, I was a frightened young woman standing alone outside Union Station with no clear future and almost no hope. A stranger bought me a cup of coffee, paid for my train ticket, and reminded me that one difficult chapter does not decide an entire life. She smiled gently as emotion softened her voice. That stranger never asked for recognition. He never asked for repayment. He simply walked away, believing kindness did not require an audience. The room remained perfectly still. Charlotte unfolded Ethan's letter. The man who changed my future has spent the last 6 years repairing lights, elevators, and broken equipment inside this building while none of us knew who he was. He never once asked for a promotion. He never once mentioned what he had done for me. Instead, when people began talking, he chose to resign so this company would not face unnecessary distractions. One elderly director slowly removed his glasses. Another lowered his eyes toward the polished table. Charlotte continued with calm conviction. We often celebrate innovation, leadership, and financial success. Today, I want us to celebrate character. Wealth built this company, but kindness gave me the courage to build that wealth in the first place. No applause followed. None was needed. The silence itself carried more respect than words ever could. Meanwhile, completely unaware of what was happening upstairs, Ethan finished replacing the final ceiling light in an empty conference room. He packed his tools with the same careful routine he had followed for years, believing this would be his final afternoon inside Hayes Global. As he stepped into the employee hallway, he heard footsteps approaching. Charlotte stood waiting beside the elevator. No executives behind her, no cameras, no reporters. Only quiet gratitude filled her expression. She held his resignation letter and slowly handed it back. "I cannot accept this," she said. Ethan looked at her with gentle surprise. "I only wanted to do what was best." Charlotte smiled warmly. "You already did that 15 years ago. You have been doing it every day since." The elevator doors opened with their familiar soft chime. Ethan glanced toward the executive elevator where their story had unexpectedly begun, then toward the employee elevator beside it. Charlotte quietly stepped away from the executive entrance and stood beside him at the ordinary employee elevator instead. "The first time," she said with a peaceful smile, "you accidentally enter my world." She looked into his calm blue eyes before adding, "This time, I choose to enter yours." The doors opened together, and without another word they stepped forward side by side, leaving behind every floor that measured success by titles alone and moving instead toward the quieter place where dignity, second chances, and genuine kindness had always been waiting for them.